The state of Oregon has statewide rent control, and they've decided to cap rents for 2024 at 10% to the detriment of all landlords. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over one of the places that I cover quite often on this channel, and that's the state of Oregon. Oregon, it's on the far west coast in a very, liberal states, right there. You got Washington, you got Oregon, and you got California. Three of the most liberal states in the entire country, and they hate landlords in these places. I mean, I know there's a lot of good people in these places. I'm not saying that everybody hates landlords, but the politicians who are put in charge, right? They don't believe in the same property rights. They don't believe in the same rights to for landlords in these places. Okay, they believe that we are evil, and they have been slowly chipping away at our rights for a long, long time. They've implemented policies such as rent control, extremely just horrible eviction protections, basically telling landlords and property owners, hey, you don't have a right to make a decision of how your business operates in our state. Instead, the government is in charge. The government's going to set what your rents are. The government's going to say who you have to house, and you have no choice about it. That's why I say, do not, especially if you're a small landlord, right? Do not, or I'm not going to say do not invest there. I'll say strongly consider investing elsewhere. Strongly consider looking at a place where property owners, they still have their rights, where landlords can still operate their businesses without the government being in our back pocket, just basically trying to steal our wallets from us. Okay, that's what I see. I see a government of a state that just absolutely just treats landlords and property owners and real estate developers and businesses like garbage. Like, we're lucky to be with you, huh? No, no, there's other places where they actually treat us with the respect that we are, that we need, that we are entitled to. Okay, so before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. So, do you think a 10% rent increase is enough? I know there's a lot of people out there and they're like, oh, well, the rents are super high. The average rent is XYZ, whatever, right? But remember, that's the average rent, or maybe it's the median rent. That means that if it's the median, that means that 50% of the rents are higher than that amount, and 50% of the rents are lower than that amount. If it's the average, you could have just a few really high rents in some places that are driving the numbers up for the entire state. Okay, so like let's say in the more popular areas of Portland, the rents might be much, much higher than they are in rural Oregon. So the people in rural Oregon might need to raise their rents by 15% or 20%. But, and I know what you're thinking. You're like, oh, well, 20%, that's way too much. Well, if the rent's only $500 a month, then raising it by 20% is now it's $600 a month. Okay, do the math. The numbers, they suck more when they're super high, right? But for the people who are already paying very rock bottom low rents, or the landlords who are only charging these super low rents, they will never be able to catch up. They will be just stuck in perpetual cheap rents to the point where they won't even be able to do maintenance on their properties because they won't be able to raise their rents enough to cover the cost. That's the kind of situation that rent control puts them in, and that's this whole sort of thing that I'm always talking against. Okay, but anyway, let's get into this article. This article is coming from OregonCapitalChronicle.com, and it says Oregon rent increases will be capped at 10% in 2024. Let's get into it. Landlords subject to Oregon's rent control law can increase rents 10% in 2024, the Department of Administrative Services announced Tuesday. That's the maximum allowed under a new law passed this year that sought to prevent most double-digit rent increases in years of high inflation. A 2019 law capped rent increases at 7% plus inflation, but high inflation in 2022 meant tenants received rent hikes as high as 14.6% this year. The new law added a 10% cap. It only applies to buildings that are at least 15 years old and doesn't apply to subsidized housing. Property managers in newer buildings can increase rent as much as they see fit, and there's no limit on how high a landlord can set rent for new tenants. So, if you listen to what I just said right there, you can see all of the flaws in their logic right there, okay? They said, okay, well, originally they had passed a rent control law that said, oh, well, we're going to cap rent at rent increase of 7% plus inflation. But what that meant was that landlords were able to increase rent by 14.6%, right? So immediately they went and changed the law. Immediately. So this is the great flaw behind rent control, right? Even with their own rent cap in place, it wasn't good enough. It wasn't good enough. They thought landlords could raise the rent too much, and then they wanted to put a cap on that. And how long will it be before this 10% cap is too much? And the next thing they'll lower it to 5%, or maybe 3%. Maybe they'll put it at zero. Maybe they'll say, oh, you know what? Now we're going to force landlords to cut their rents every year. I mean, believe me, they probably would get more votes if they did that. They don't give a crap about what it actually costs because remember, inflation is what inflation is. Okay? If the cost of everything increases and we are unable to cover those costs, well, it's not like we can just call. Oh yeah, call a power company. No, no, no. Yep, they capped my rent, so I can't pay you as much for these utilities as you would like. You can't call up the local municipality. Oh no, no, they capped my rent, so that property tax increase. Nope, I can't pay that because they capped my rents. No, you can't do that either. Same with your insurance company. Nope. The repairman who fixes your building, you can't call them up and tell them that you're not going to pay those increased costs. Yet they sit here and they tell you that you can't charge increased costs. So that means that you have to eat them. You have to eat those costs, and there's nothing you can do about it. But maybe there is something you can do about it, right? And this is what I suggest to all the people who think that, oh yeah, well, we're just stuck, right? Well, look for a way out. Get out of these places with rent control. Let them die, okay? That's my personal opinion. Let the properties get, just run down, and you see it in a place like New York where landlords, they can't pay for all the maintenance and the capital expenditures, right? Because they can't increase their rents, and the properties, they just become more and more in disrepair as time goes by. And you start reading about these huge bankruptcies of rent control landlords. I just covered on my community tab a landlord up in New York who had lost on the sale of the property like almost $40 million. Like, you think property prices are always going up, right? But when they bought the property in 2016 in New York City, a rent control portfolio of rent control properties. They bought it in 2016 and they sold it for nearly a $40 million loss here in 2023. That's what rent control does. It will devalue your properties. It will make it so that they are worth less than what you paid for them. You know? Meanwhile, all the other properties in the country are becoming more valuable, and you see the issue. You see the issue, right? You bankrupt these landlords, you drive them out of the business, and you think this is going to end up well for tenants? It's not. It's not. The tenants end up living in dilapidated, unsafe properties where they're just living in just horrible conditions, and just so they can save rent, just so they can save a little bit of rent. So I'm against rent control. Everybody knows that. I don't support this sort of thing. I don't support a rent cap, especially, um, well, I don't support any price controls by the government. It's disastrous. The costs will be pushed on to someone else. So the savings that these tenants received is pushed on to the landlord. Okay, it's not like the cost actually like the actual amount of rent actually disappears. Like, oh yeah, well we just it's like saying that, oh, it cost, let's say it cost $50,000 for a car manufacturer to build a car. But then the government comes in and says, well, you can only charge $30,000 for it. That doesn't mean that the cost to build the car was suddenly only $30,000. It's still 50 grand, but now they expect somebody else to cover that additional 20 grand. And whether it is the government or whether it is the property owner, or the manufacturer, the property owner, or whatever, right? Price control means that basically the actual cost is pushed onto someone else. And in the case of this rent control, it is always going to be the landlord.